is that Indigenous peoples have had to face, we've had to face our annihilation. So again, in the Royal Commission, Truth and Reconciliation Commission, 90% of our population decimated through disease. Sylvia talked a lot about this history. So we've already had to do that. We've already been relocated from our territories. We're a lot of us on reserves, a lot of people in urban settings now, which is still our territories, is the land acknowledgement acknowledged. But we've been through what everyone else is just starting to face. So we've already done that. We've already been there, and here we are. So I'm part of the Anishinaabe Nation. My ancestors did what they needed to do so I could be here as an Anishinaabe person. So their point is that we've been through that, and here we are. So maybe other people can learn from us. Maybe there's some things we have to say about how to survive and what we might need to do for the future, as opposed to just thinking about like wallowing in the current state that we're in. And that these processes of colonialism and capitalism, industrialization, globalizations are huge threats. Like those processes created the challenges that we faced historically, yet here we are. Because again, part of this history that Sylvia talked about was a very explicit policy of the Prime Minister, MacDonald, there would be no more Indians in 100 years. That didn't work, because here we are. And so now they've got the Indian problem that Sylvia talked about is completely misguided. So we have something to say about this. But at the same time, there's a tension that exists. We're still really vulnerable because our ties are still continuing to be disruptive. And that's why colonialism is relevant in the discussions. Because if it doesn't deal with that, then the vulnerability is still going to be there. If the policies that they have federally and provincially at every level don't deal with the issues of lands and resources, then we're still going to have these challenges. So we have adapted and we have survived, and maybe there's something to learn from us. So one of the ways that we managed to do it, and this is consistently said, is through, and Sylvia pointed this out, is through language and our traditional activities and being on the land. So this is my family. We closed up our sugar bush maybe a couple of weeks ago. It was kind of weird weather, so sometimes it would get warm and then cold, and it was too cold. So it was these kind of activities that it was this kind of life and this kind of commitment that enabled us to survive what we did, the challenges that we faced, that everyone else is just starting to encounter. So someone like Kyle White calls this déjà vu, like our realities, and facing climate change is like, we've seen this kind of catastrophe coming our way before. But they also talked about a lot of the environmental change that we faced was brought on by colonialism. So for example, killing the buffalo, like that was part of people's governance and food and everything. To see that gone, like that was a huge environmental change in terms of how people lived and what the relationships were with buffalo, but also the ecology of the landscape that the buffalo maintained. So you actually have this major dramatic environmental change that people had to adjust to. And also Sylvia talked about that in relation to massive clear cutting of the boreal forest. So we've had to adjust to major environmental change because of colonialism. Like that's why we had to deal with it. So to face the changes that we're going to face now, we have to deal with that. We can't pretend it shouldn't be any part of any kind of policies or process around environmental change. One thing that we do think about is also the impact on non-human relatives, teachers, the plants and animals as well, and their role in this process. And as far as I can tell, most policies don't deal with that, except in terms of biodiversity, but they don't see them as being teachers and relatives. And in my view, and we have lots of stories that speak to what we learn from animals and what we learn from birds. And I don't have time to get into what some of those stories are, but they're instructive, like they instruct us. Because really they're smarter than us, because we were in the Anishinaabe tradition anyway, people came last in creation because we had to learn from all the other relatives. We didn't really know how to survive and we needed them. So we're not the smartest in creation, and we have to learn from the other teachers and relatives. And climate change policy does not recognize that. If we keep thinking we can solve it. In some of our stories, we don't necessarily have the answers and we have to look elsewhere. So, again, this is just a quote from Kyle White. I think what I wanted to say here, again, the point about, at the same time we've managed to survive and live through and have a future through the massive change that we've had to deal with in our lives, but at the same time, so we have that strength and capacity, but at the same time we have this other tension around these ongoing policies continue to constrain us and our ability to be able to adapt. And I find a lot of the climate change dialogue, or the climate change agenda, for lack of a better word, because that would mean policies and governance and agreements and accords that are signed, is what I mean by that, tends to be very dominated by science. So, and you know, I agree that the IPCC and all those reports, like they're finding horrible things, but a lot of it's still based on science. Because I've been asked by a couple of federal agencies to talk about traditional knowledge and climate change in their submissions, but it has to only be evidence-based and from the peer-reviewed literature. Like, but a lot of our knowledge, that's not where it is. So it's like hugely biased. And again, like we do have to take it seriously, and we do have to respond to that, but it doesn't consider other knowledge. It's not very good at traditional knowledge. And really, when it comes down to it, and some of the work that I've done in working with elders and youth and others, when we say, what is the source of climate change, they don't go into the definition of it that you'll find in the IPCC reports and the federal government reports. They just say, well, basically it's greed. People are taking way more than they need. Like they don't, their answer isn't science. Their answer is other things. I'm like, so it's very limited in sort of the discussion. What that means is, if that's how you're defining the problem, then that really shapes what you think the solution is going to be. So just Indigenous climate change studies. So again, like a lot of what we've faced is because of a colonial history. A lot of scholars like myself, again, Kyle White, Zoe Todd, and others speak to our knowledge systems as being a way to kind of self-determine our future in the face of what we're dealing with, because we've had to do it before. What's going to bail us out of the situation that we're in? It's going to be the language, it's going to be connection to the land, it's going to be our traditional knowledge and cultural knowledge, it's going to be our own laws and being able to enact and to live those. So we need to imagine this future from our perspective, because again, the other perspective is very skewed in a certain direction. If people just think, well, let's just make this green and it'll all be better, and it's like, no, you shouldn't even want that. Like, consume that. Like, it's a completely different way of thinking. Like, so for example, one of the elders that I learned from, he's since passed away. We were talking about sustainability and sustainable development. And the UN Declaration is basically, how do you keep sustaining this unsustainable life? Like, how do we keep doing that? You know, make things more green and whatever else. Science will solve a lot of these problems for us. And he said, no. It's like, for Anishinaabe, we get up every day and we think about what is our gift going to be to creation, not what we're going to take. So it's a completely different way of thinking about that relationship and what our obligations are. And that's the kind of future we want to imagine, not where we're going to keep taking so we can continue to be unsustainable and live in a society that consumes way more than it needs. You actually think about what's your gift going to be back to creation so creation can flourish. That's a very different way of thinking about that relationship.